Some stories are so impossible that medical professionals are forbidden from discussing them publicly. But if you're someone who believes that miracles are documented reality, not fairy tales, then what I'm about to share will change everything. You think you know about the connection between life and death? Grace Williams was a hospice nurse who thought she'd seen every type of final request until Samuel Rodriguez looked her in the eyes and asked her to drive him to see the ocean one last time. She almost said no because of hospital protocols. She almost dismissed it as the confused rambling of a dying man. But something in his voice made her agree to break every rule she'd ever followed in her 15-year career. During that 3-hour drive from Denver to the Colorado coast, Samuel began describing a beach with such vivid detail that Grace's hands started trembling on the steering wheel. The texture of the sand between weathered rocks, the sound of waves crashing against granite cliffs, it's the exact positioning of driftwood that had been carved smooth by decades of storms. These weren't the vague descriptions of someone remembering a vacation. These were the precise details of someone who had walked that shore 1,000 times. But Samuel had never left Colorado. His medical records confirmed it. Born in Denver, lived his entire 73 years within 50 miles of the hospital where he was dying. So how could he describe with photographic accuracy the remote stretch of coastline in Maine, where Grace's father had disappeared 15 years ago? His body never found, his family never given closure. How could a dying stranger in Colorado know details about Pemaquat Point that Grace had spent 15 years trying to forget? And why did Samuel's descriptions trigger dreams so vivid that Grace would wake up smelling salt air and feeling sand beneath her feet? What happened next would prove that sometimes the dying become messengers for the living, and that some connections between souls transcend everything we think we know about life, death, and the invisible threads that bind us across time and space. Grace Williams had been working the night shift at Denver Memorial's hospice wing for exactly 15 years when she first met Samuel Rodriguez. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as she made her rounds, checking on patients who existed in that liminal space between this world and whatever comes next. She'd grown accustomed to the weight of final requests. Some wanted to call estranged children. Others asked for a particular song to be played, or a window opened so they could feel fresh air one last time. Grace had learned to say yes whenever possible, understanding that dignity in death often lived in these small moments of choice. But Samuel's request was different. Room 314 smelled of antiseptic and the faint sweetness that seemed to follow terminal patients. Samuel lay propped against white pillows, his weathered hands folded over a hospital blanket that had been washed thin by countless cycles. At 73, cancer had carved deep lines around his dark eyes. But there was a clarity there that made Grace pause in the doorway. "Nurse," he called softly, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place. "I need to ask you something that might sound crazy." Grace approached his bedside, noting how his breathing was labored but steady. According to his chart, he had maybe a week left, 2 at most. His family lived in California and wouldn't arrive until the weekend. "I'm listening, Samuel." He turned his head to face her fully, and she felt an unexpected chill run down her spine. "I need to see the ocean. One last time. I know it's not protocol. I know you probably can't, but I'm asking anyway." Grace had heard similar requests before. Patients wanting to visit childhood homes, favorite restaurants, places that held meaning. The hospital occasionally allowed compassionate trips for those with slightly better prognoses. But Samuel's condition made travel nearly impossible. "Samuel, I understand the desire, but you're on oxygen and the nearest coast is 3 hours away. Your doctor would never approve it, and I could lose my job for even considering it." But something in his expression stopped her from saying an outright no. His eyes held a desperate urgency that felt different from the normal fear of dying she'd witnessed thousands of times. "Please," he whispered. "I can feel them waiting for me there. At the water's edge. I know exactly where I need to go." The phrase sent goosebumps across Grace's arms. She'd worked with dying patients long enough to recognize the difference between medication-induced confusion and something deeper. Samuel wasn't rambling. He was lucid, focused, almost pleading. "Where exactly do you want to go?" she found herself asking. Samuel's eyes brightened with an intensity that seemed to illuminate his entire face. "There's a stretch of coastline where granite cliffs meet the sea. The rocks are worn smooth by decades of storms. And there's a particular piece of driftwood that's been carved into the shape of a reaching hand. The sand there isn't like regular beach sand. It's coarser, mixed with tiny pieces of shell and seaweed that the tide brings in twice daily." Grace felt her breath catch. The description was impossibly specific, painted with the kind of detail that only came from intimate familiarity. "The sound the waves make when they crash against those cliffs," Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger. "It's not like other beaches. It echoes in a way that makes you feel like you're inside a cathedral. And there's always a mist that rises just before sunset, carrying the smell of salt and something else, something ancient." Her hands began to tremble as she gripped the metal rail of his hospital bed. Every word Samuel spoke felt like a key turning in a lock she'd kept sealed for 15 years. "Samuel," she said carefully, "have you ever been to Maine?" He looked confused by the question. "Maine? No. I've lived in Colorado my whole life. Born in Denver, never had reason to leave. Why do you ask?" Grace stared at him, her mind racing. What he just described, down to the last impossible detail, was Pimo Quad Point, the exact stretch of coastline where her father, David Williams, had disappeared on a fishing trip when she was 22 years old. The place where Coast Guard search teams had combed the waters for weeks, finding nothing. The beach where she'd stood for hours, days, waiting for any sign of the man who'd raised her alone after her mother moved to California when Grace was 10. "I'll take you," she heard herself say. Samuel's entire face transformed with relief and gratitude. "You will." Grace nodded, already calculating the risks. She could use her accumulated vacation days. She could arrange for portable oxygen. She could sign the necessary waivers and take full responsibility. But none of that explained why she was agreeing to transport a dying man 3 hours away from medical facilities to visit a place he'd never been, but somehow knew better than she did. As she left his room to make the arrangements, one thought echoed in her mind with unsettling clarity. Samuel had described Pemaquid Point as a place where souls waited at the water's edge. But how could he possibly know that her father was still waiting there? 3 days later, Grace found herself driving a medical transport van through the Rocky Mountains with Samuel strapped to a portable gurney in the back, an oxygen tank humming steadily beside him. She'd filled out more liability forms than she thought existed, used every vacation day she'd accumulated, and convinced Dr. Martinez to sign off on what he called the most unconventional compassionate care request of his 30-year career. But none of that mattered now, as Samuel's voice drifted from behind her, painting impossible pictures with his words. "The lighthouse there," he was saying, his breathing labored but his voice clear. "It's been automated for decades, but you can still see the keeper's quarters. White paint peeling from the salt air, and there's a brass bell that rings when the wind hits it just right." Grace's knuckles went white against the steering wheel. Pemaquid Point Light had indeed been automated since the 1930s. And yes, there was a brass bell that her father used to ring every time they visited when she was a child. But Samuel couldn't possibly know that. If you're still with me at this point, it means you're exactly the kind of person who understands that reality is far more magical than we've been taught. There's a growing community of us here who recognize that these aren't coincidences, they're miracles. Subscribe to this channel because what happens next in Samuel's story is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about the connection between souls. And trust me, you don't want to miss a single detail of how this impossible transformation unfolds. "Tell me about the driftwood again," Grace said, her voice barely steady. Samuel shifted on the gurney, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "It's about 30 feet from the high tide line, wedged between two granite boulders that look like sleeping giants. The wood is gray-silver from years of salt water, smooth as glass, except for the grain lines that run through it like veins. When you touch it, it's surprisingly warm, like it's been holding on to sunlight, even on cloudy days. Tears began forming in Grace's eyes. She remembered that piece of driftwood. Her father had discovered it when she was 12, and they'd spent an entire afternoon trying to move it closer to their favorite sitting spot. It was impossibly heavy, waterlogged, and wedged tight, but her father had been determined. They'd finally given up, laughing and breathless, deciding it belonged exactly where the ocean had placed it. "There's something else about that place," Samuel continued, his voice taking on a dreamy quality. "Sometimes, when the fog rolls in just before dawn, you can see figures walking along the shoreline. Not clearly, just shadows moving through the mist. They're not threatening, just present, waiting." Grace pulled over at a rest stop, her hands shaking too badly to continue driving safely. She turned to face Samuel, whose eyes were closed, but whose face held an expression of profound peace. "Samuel, I need you to tell me exactly what you're seeing when you describe this place." He opened his eyes, and for a moment they seemed to look right through her to something beyond the van windows. "I see a man standing at the water's edge, tall, maybe 6'2", wearing a faded blue fishing vest with multiple pockets. There's a scar on his left hand, shaped like a crescent moon from where a fishhook caught him as a child. His hair is gray at the temples, and he's looking out at the horizon like he's waiting for someone to come home." Grace's breath caught in her throat. The scar on her father's hand was family legend, from when he'd tried to remove a hook with his teeth at age 7 and it had slipped, cutting deep into the flesh between his thumb and forefinger. The fishing vest was the one she'd given him for his 50th birthday. Navy blue canvas with enough pockets for every type of lure he owned. "He's been standing there for a long time," Samuel whispered. 15 years, maybe more. "He's not lost, he's not in pain. He's just waiting for his daughter to know that he's okay. That he forgives her for the fight they had before he left. That he understands why she became a nurse. Why she chose to help other people say goodbye when she never got to say goodbye to him." Grace felt the world tilting around her. She'd never told anyone about the fight she'd had with her father the morning he left for his fishing trip. How she'd accused him of caring more about fish than his own family. How she'd stormed out of the house without saying she loved him. And those had been the last words they'd ever exchanged. "How?" she whispered. "How could you possibly know any of this?" Samuel's eyes focused on her with crystal clarity. "Because he asked me to tell you. It's because some messages are too important to trust to dreams or signs. Sometimes the dying have to become messengers for the living." Grace stared at him, her rational mind warring with something deeper. Something that recognized truth even when it defied every law of physics she'd ever learned. "We need to get to that beach," Samuel said urgently. "It's been waiting so long, and I don't have much time left to deliver his message." As Grace restarted the van, her cell phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was simple, but it made her blood run cold. "The tide is coming in. It's ready to go home now." But Grace's phone had no signal in the mountains, and the number it came from had been disconnected for 15 years. By the time they reached the Maine coastline, something had fundamentally changed in Samuel's condition. Instead of the expected deterioration from the long journey, he seemed energized by an invisible presence that Grace could feel but not see. His breathing had improved, his color was better, and his eyes held a luminescence that defied medical explanation. Grace parked the van in the small gravel lot overlooking Pemaquat Point, and the sound of crashing waves immediately filled the silence. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the granite cliffs, and the familiar salt-tinged air brought back a flood of memories she'd spent 15 years suppressing. "Help me out," Samuel said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "I need to stand at the edge." Grace carefully transferred him to a wheelchair she'd borrowed from the hospital, along with a portable oxygen tank. As they approached the cliff's edge, Samuel began describing what he was seeing with an intensity that made the hair on Grace's arms stand on end. "He's there," Samuel whispered, pointing to a spot about 50 feet down the shoreline, standing exactly where I said he would be. Apt. Blue fishing vest, gray hair, that crescent scar catching the sunlight. He's smiling now because he knows you're here. Grace looked in the direction Samuel was pointing, but saw only empty beach and waves. Yet something in the air felt different, charged with an energy that made her skin tingle and her heart race. "What is he saying?" she asked, surprised by her own willingness to accept this impossible conversation. Samuel closed his eyes, tilting his head as if listening to a voice only he could hear. "He says he's proud of you for choosing to help people transition peacefully. He says the work you do, sitting with families during their darkest moments, it's sacred work. He's been watching over every patient you've comforted, every hand you've held." Tears began streaming down Grace's face. Her decision to become a hospice nurse had been driven by the unfinished business of her father's death, the lack of closure, the sudden disappearance that had left so many words unsaid. "He wants you to know," Samuel continued, his voice taking on an otherworldly quality, "that the morning he left, after you walked out angry, he sat in his truck for 20 minutes trying to decide whether to follow you. He almost did. He almost knocked on your apartment door to tell you that you were right, that he had been using fishing as an escape from dealing with your mother's abandonment." Grace gasped. She'd never told anyone that her father had been in the parking lot that morning. She'd seen his truck from her bedroom window, but had been too proud and too hurt to go downstairs. "But he decided to give you space to cool down," Samuel said, his breathing becoming deeper, more rhythmic. "He planned to call you from the boat to apologize and ask if you wanted to have dinner when he got back. He had your favorite pizza place on speed dial." This specific detail hit Grace like a physical blow. Tony's Pizza had indeed been their tradition for making up after arguments, and her father had programmed their number into his phone just weeks before he disappeared. Samuel suddenly opened his eyes wide, staring at something in the distance with an expression of wonder and recognition. He's not alone anymore. There are others with him, people who've been waiting at this threshold, helping souls transition safely to whatever comes next. "What does he look like now?" Grace whispered. "Peaceful, complete. The worry lines are gone from his face, and he's standing taller, like a weight has been lifted from his shoulders. He says he's been serving as a guide for others who died suddenly, helping them understand that death isn't an ending, it's a doorway." Samuel turned to look directly at Grace, and for a moment his eyes seemed to reflect depths that had nothing to do with his own consciousness. "He says to tell you that the guilt you've carried, the belief that your anger somehow caused his death, it's not true. His boat engine failed in a sudden storm. He had less than 2 minutes to think, and he spent those 2 minutes not being afraid, but being grateful for every moment he'd shared with you." Grace sobbed openly now, 15 years of suppressed grief and self-blame pouring out of her like a dam bursting. "There's more," Samuel said gently. "He says there's a reason you found me, a reason you agreed to bring me here. He's been trying to reach you for years, through dreams and signs. But your guilt was blocking the connection. You needed a messenger, someone who could cross between worlds temporarily." Samuel's medical monitors began beeping rapidly, but instead of distress, his face showed profound joy. He's ready to move on now, to whatever comes after this waiting place. But first, he needs you to forgive yourself. He needs you to understand that love doesn't end with death. It just transforms into something we don't have words for. As the sun began to set over Pemaquad Point, Samuel reached into his hospital gown and pulled out something that made Grace's world completely stop spinning. It was a brass fishing lure, tarnished with age and salt water, with the initials DW carved into the metal. Her father's lucky lure. The one he'd never fished without. The one that had disappeared with him 15 years ago. "How is this possible?" Grace whispered, taking the lure with trembling hands. Samuel smiled, and for just a moment, his face seemed to shimmer and change, taking on features that looked remarkably like her father's. Because sometimes, love finds a way to bridge any distance, even the distance between life and death. At that exact moment, Grace's phone buzzed with another impossible text from her father's disconnected number. This time, it simply read, "Thank you for bringing me home. I love you, Gracie." And as she looked up from her phone, she could swear she saw a tall figure in a blue fishing vest walking into the sunset, finally at peace. As darkness fell over Pemaquid Point, Samuel's vital signs began fluctuating wildly, but his consciousness remained crystal clear, as if he were being sustained by forces beyond medical understanding. Grace had moved him closer to the cliff's edge, where the sound of waves created a natural rhythm that seemed to synchronize with his labored breathing. "I can see the pathway now," Samuel whispered, his eyes fixed on the horizon where moonlight created a silver bridge across the dark water. "It's beautiful, Grace, like walking on liquid starlight." Grace held his hand, feeling the warmth slowly leaving his fingers. In her other hand, she clutched her father's fishing lure, its weight somehow comforting despite the impossibility of its presence. "He's waiting for me," Samuel continued, his voice growing fainter, but maintaining an otherworldly clarity. "Your father. He says he has one more message before he can cross over completely." Grace leaned closer, her heart pounding with anticipation and grief. Samuel's eyes suddenly rolled back, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed entirely. It was deeper, carrying the gentle authority she remembered from childhood bedtime stories and scraped-knee comforts. "Gracie, my little girl." The voice was unmistakably her father's, speaking through Samuel's lips with such perfect inflection that Grace felt her knees buckle. She gripped the wheelchair for support, staring at Samuel's face, which seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. "Dad," she whispered, "I need you to call your mother tonight. She's been having the same dreams about me standing on this beach, and she's been afraid to tell you because she thinks you blame her for leaving, but she never stopped loving either of us, and she deserves to know I'm at peace." Grace sobbed, remembering how her parents' marriage had crumbled under the weight of unspoken grief and growing apart. Her mother had moved to California when Grace was 10, leaving father and daughter to navigate life together. "Your mother has been carrying guilt too," the voice continued. "She thinks if she hadn't left, I wouldn't have been out on that boat alone, trying to process my feelings in the only way I knew how. She needs to hear that I forgive her, that I understand why she had to go." Samuel's body suddenly convulsed, and Grace could see him fighting to maintain the connection. Medical alarms from his portable monitors filled the air, but Grace ignored them completely. "There's something else," her father's voice said urgently. "In 3 days, your mother is going to find something washed up on the shore near her house in California. My fishing vest. It's been traveling the ocean currents for 15 years, waiting for the right moment to surface. When she calls you crying, you'll know this was all real." Grace's phone buzzed in her pocket. Despite her emotional state, she glanced at it and saw a call coming in from a California number she hadn't seen in 2 years. Her mother. With trembling hands, she answered. "Grace." Her mother's voice was raw with tears. "Honey, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I've been having these dreams about your father. He's standing on a beach in Maine, the one where he used to take you fishing, and he looks peaceful. I think he's trying to tell us something." Grace looked at Samuel, whose eyes had returned to normal, but held a knowing smile. She realized this moment had been orchestrated by forces far beyond coincidence. "Mom," Grace said, her voice breaking, "I'm in Maine right now, at Pemaquid Point, and I think Dad wants us to talk." The conversation that followed lasted over an hour. Through tears and laughter, Grace and her mother shared 15 years of suppressed grief, guilt, and love. They talked about her father's stubborn kindness, his terrible jokes, his way of humming while he fixed things around the house. They forgave each other for words spoken in anger and words never spoken at all. When Grace finally hung up, Samuel was watching her with eyes that seemed ancient and wise. "The pathway is getting brighter," he whispered. "Your father says thank you for helping his family heal. He says that was his unfinished business, the reason he couldn't move on." Samuel's breathing became shallow, but his face radiated profound peace. "Grace, I need you to know something about me, about why I was chosen to be his messenger. 50 years ago, I lost my own daughter in a car accident. I spent decades angry at God, angry at the universe, angry at the unfairness of it all. But your father found me in the in-between place, that space where souls wait before crossing over. He taught me that serving others, helping families find closure, that's how we heal our own wounds. Grace felt a deep understanding wash over her. Samuel hadn't been a random patient. He'd been specifically chosen, prepared, guided to her hospital room because her father knew she would be the nurse willing to take an impossible risk for a dying man's final wish. "When I cross over tonight," Samuel said, his voice barely audible above the waves, "your father and I will continue this work from the other side. We'll find other families who need healing, other messengers willing to bridge the gap between worlds." Samuel's eyes fluttered closed, and his breathing slowed to match the rhythm of the tide. Grace held his hand as his life force gradually ebbed away, but instead of sadness, she felt surrounded by an incredible warmth and light. At 11:47 p.m., according to her watch, Samuel Rodriguez took his final breath. But as he did, Grace felt a presence lift away from his body and merge with something larger. Something that filled the entire coastline with love and gratitude. Looking out at the moonlit water, she whispered, "Thank you, Dad. Thank you, Samuel. I understand now." As if in response, a gentle breeze carried the distant sound of that brass bell from the lighthouse, ringing once, clear and sweet, across the sacred space where souls learn to say goodbye. 3 months later, Grace Williams stood in the same spot at Pemiquod Point, but everything had changed. The granite cliffs looked the same. The waves crashed with their familiar cathedral echo, and the weathered driftwood still rested between the sleeping giant boulders. But Grace herself had been transformed into someone who understood that death was not an ending, but a sacred transition. She was no longer alone on the cliff. Her mother, Linda, stood beside her, holding a small urn containing Samuel's ashes. True to her father's prediction, Linda had found his fishing vest washed up on a California beach exactly 3 days after Samuel's death, perfectly preserved after 15 years in the ocean. The discovery had shattered any remaining doubt about what they'd experienced. "I can feel them both here," Linda whispered, her gray hair catching the afternoon sunlight. "Your father and Samuel. They're peaceful." Grace nodded, understanding now that some presences never truly leave. They just transform into something we carry within us. The guilt that had driven her into hospice nursing had evolved into something far more powerful. A gift for helping families navigate the sacred space between life and death. Since returning from Maine, Grace had noticed changes in her ability to comfort grieving families. She could sense when patients were receiving visits from deceased loved ones. She could help families understand that the strange dreams sees the meaningful coincidences. The unexplained moments of comfort were not wishful thinking, but actual communications from souls who had learned to speak in the language of love. Her supervisor, Dr. Martinez, had been initially skeptical of her request to start a new program called Sacred Transitions, designed to help families recognize and process spiritual experiences during end-of-life care. But when family after family began reporting profound healing and closure after working with Grace, the program expanded to 3 other hospitals in Colorado. Samuel would have loved this, Grace said, scattering his ashes into the wind that carried them out over the water where her father's spirit had waited so patiently. He always said his greatest joy was helping families find peace. As they watched the ashes disappear into the mist, Grace's phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. She'd learned not to be surprised by these anymore. The message read, "New patient in room 314. Terminal diagnosis. Keeps talking about needing to visit a specific cemetery in Ohio to deliver a message. Thought you should know. Dr. Martinez." Grace smiled, understanding that her work as a bridge between worlds was just beginning. Samuel and her father had taught her that some souls become eternal messengers, helping the living understand that love transcends every boundary, including death itself. Linda took her daughter's hand as they walked back toward the lighthouse. "Your father would be so proud of the woman you've become," she said. "Not because of what you do, but because of how you've learned to love without fear." As they reached the car, Grace turned back one final time. In the golden light of sunset, she could swear she saw two figures standing at the water's edge. One tall man in a blue fishing vest and another smaller man with kind eyes. Both of them smiling and waving before dissolving into the mist that always rose just before darkness fell. Grace knew she would return to Pemaquide Point every year, not to mourn what was lost, but to celebrate what was eternal. She had learned the greatest truth that any soul can discover. Death is not the opposite of life. It's the transformation of love into something that can never be destroyed. Driving back toward the airport with her mother beside her, Grace felt the weight of her father's fishing lure in her pocket. Not as a relic of grief, but as a reminder that some connections are stronger than the distance between worlds. She had 3 new patients waiting for her in Denver. 3 families who needed to understand that their loved ones' final journeys were not endings, but sacred beginnings. Samuel Rodriguez had asked to see the ocean one last time, but what he'd really done was teach a broken-hearted nurse that healing happens when we become willing to serve as messengers for love itself. And in the years that followed, Grace would help hundreds of families discover that the dying don't leave us behind. They simply learn to love us from a place beyond our understanding, waiting patiently for the day when all souls are reunited in the endless light that exists beyond every shore. 5 years have passed since Samuel Rodriguez changed Grace Williams' life forever. And the ripple effects of that impossible journey continue to transform lives across the country. Grace now directs the Sacred Transitions program in 12 hospitals, training nurses and doctors to recognize and honor the spiritual experiences that occur during end-of-life care. But the most profound change isn't in her career. It's in her understanding of what death really means. Last week, Grace received a letter from a family in Texas whose grandmother had been one of her patients 3 years ago. The grandmother had passed peacefully after describing vivid visits from her deceased husband. Visits that Grace had helped the family understand were real communications, not hallucinations. Now the granddaughter was studying to become a hospice nurse. Inspired by Grace's approach to death as a sacred transition rather than a medical failure, the letter included a photograph. The granddaughter standing on a beach in Galveston, holding her grandmother's ashes and smiling through tears. On the back, someone had written, "She's here with us. We can feel her peace." Grace keeps that photograph on her desk next to another image that arrived mysteriously in her hospital mailbox 2 years ago. It shows Pemaquide Point at sunset, with 2 figures barely visible in the golden mist at the water's edge. No one ever claimed to have sent it, but Grace knows exactly who those figures are. Her mother visits Denver every few months now, and they've grown closer than they ever were when Grace was a child. Linda often says that losing David taught them how to love each other, but finding him again taught them how to love without fear of loss. The fishing lure that Samuel gave her that impossible night has become something of a legend in the hospice community. Grace carries it with her to every difficult case, and families have begun to understand that when she touches it while sitting with their dying loved ones, something sacred is about to happen. Patients who have been agitated suddenly find peace. Family members who have been consumed by guilt suddenly find forgiveness. And sometimes, just sometimes, messages are delivered from souls who have already crossed over, but needed to send one final communication of love. Grace has learned that she's not unique. Around the world, there are healthcare workers, counselors, and ordinary people who have discovered their ability to serve as bridges between worlds. They find each other through the program she's developed, sharing stories that would sound impossible to anyone who hasn't experienced the profound truth that love transcends death. Samuel's room, 314, has been quietly designated as the messenger room by the nursing staff. It's where they place patients who seem to be receiving visits from deceased loved ones, who speak of seeing relatives who have passed on, who describe places they've never been with impossible accuracy. The staff has learned to listen rather than medicate, to honor rather than dismiss, to recognize these experiences as gifts rather than symptoms. But perhaps the most beautiful transformation is in Grace herself. The The woman who once carried 15 years of guilt and grief now radiates a peace that patients and families can feel the moment she enters a room. She has learned that helping souls transition peacefully isn't just her job. It's her calling, her gift, her way of honoring both Samuel's sacrifice and her father's eternal love. Every night before leaving the hospital, Grace stands for a moment in room 314, now empty, but somehow never truly vacant. She whispers a prayer of gratitude to Samuel and her father, and she asks for continued guidance in serving families who are learning to say goodbye. And sometimes, when the evening light hits the window just right, she can see them there. Two figures standing at the threshold between worlds, watching over every soul who passes through that sacred space, ensuring that no one crosses over alone and no family is left without hope. The work continues. The love continues. And Grace Williams has learned the most important truth any soul can discover. Death may end a life, but it never ends a relationship built on love that transcends every boundary between heaven and earth. Grace's story teaches us that miracles aren't rare occurrences reserved for the lucky few. They're constant invitations for those brave enough to say yes to the impossible, to take risks for dying strangers, to believe that love is stronger than every law of physics we think we understand. Right now, somewhere in the world, there's a healthcare worker listening to a patient describe a place they've never been. There's a family member receiving a message that defies explanation. There's someone standing at the threshold between grief and healing, waiting for the courage to believe that their loved ones haven't disappeared. They've simply learned to communicate in a language we're only beginning to understand. Samuel Rodriguez's final gift wasn't just to Grace and her family. It was to everyone who hears his story and realizes that we all have the capacity to become messengers for souls who need their love delivered to the living. Every act of compassion, every moment of presence with someone who is suffering, every willingness to listen to the impossible creates a bridge between worlds. The question isn't whether miracles happen. The question is whether we're willing to recognize them when they appear in our lives, often disguised as dying patients with impossible requests, as dreams that feel too real to dismiss, as synchronicities that make us question everything we thought we knew about life and death. Grace Williams discovered that when we serve love without fear, we become conduits for forces far greater than ourselves. She learned that the dying don't need our medical expertise as much as they need our willingness to honor their journey as sacred, to recognize their final messages as gifts rather than symptoms, to understand that saying goodbye is really saying hello to a love that never ends. Your own miracle may be waiting in the next impossible request, the next inexplicable dream, the next moment when you choose to believe that the universe is far more magical and interconnected than logic allows. Grace's father waited 15 years at the water's edge, and Samuel crossed between worlds to deliver his message, because some love is so powerful it refuses to be silenced by death. What messages are waiting to be delivered through your willingness to serve? What healing is waiting to happen through your courage to say yes to the impossible? What miracle is waiting for you to become brave enough to believe that love truly does transcend every boundary between earth and heaven?